Well, welcome again to the wonderful world of Geospatial-Next. This is great value for money. I'm going to give you 2 videos in 1 week. It's getting close to Christmas and we need to crack through some things. So we will continue the conversation around Geospatial-Next strategy, building and execution. This is essentially step 2. So if you haven't seen the previous one, please feel free to watch that. What we're going to focus on in this one is choosing the best idea. So let's get stuck into it. So we've got a lot to cover in this talk, but before we dive into the details, I wanted just to make reference, and I mentioned in the last talk that I did about some of the shoulders that this work sits on. This is one of them. If you haven't read this book, this is probably the best book on strategy I've read. Roger Martin does lots of videos, and he co-wrote this with a chap named Lafley. It's really a good book, and some of the ideas that are in what I'm going to show today and over the next couple of talks are built against some of the things, some of the ideas and frameworks that Roger has outlined in this particular book. So if you haven't read it, take a look at that book. It's a really good book. So the generating possibilities process. Let's just have a quick review of what we spoke about last time. So generating possibilities. I walk through what essentially is a framework for building out a group of ideas. Essentially, ideas as to where to answer that what next question. And again, for reference, this is really focused on within the world that I've inhabited for most of my career. Companies that are looking to grow, companies that are looking to take advantage of the new data and new technology that are out there in the geospatial world. So it might be service companies, it might be product companies, but it's moving to that next thing. It's adding additional services, it's building new products. So again, thinking about this process, there's been the ideation process is a mixed bag, and I shared last time how I've often seen it fail. My belief is that, and what I've seen done most successfully is it's really following a framework. And again, the idea of this is to bring a small group together, maybe a small group of experts in a particular area, for them to be creative in the process of conversation around ideas, but to actually have a framework for it instead of being idle conversations. To actually have a framework. This differs slightly from what Roger Martin talks about, but I think the approach that I've seen the most successful is if there's sort of a guiding set of steps for ultimately what is going to be a storytelling process, and we'll cover that in a minute. So again, just to walk through that, there's the notion of ideation, throwing things around that ideas that are potential pain points for customers, validating some of those ideas, talking to customers. Looking at the marketplace, is there competition there? Is it a high value problem that needs a solution? That's kind of the validation piece. Discovery is more of a technical conversation. Again, all of this is a high level. So do we have the in-house expertise to achieve what we need to achieve? Is it doable from a cost perspective? Do we need to bring in partners? Those kind of questions are answered in that third step. And then the fourth one is a high-level business model overview, and really is how we're going to make money. That's ultimately the question that's asked at that step. That's the basis of a story which becomes the possibility. So this, if you've walked through this process, and I'll give you an example of this in a moment, we've generated one possibility from this process, and we've built a structured story to justify why we think this might be worth further conversation. So just to guide you as to where we're going to go today, we're actually going to move into this strategic choice process. So that's what our ultimate goal in this conversation is. Where this is going to lead to in the next talk is actually around this notion of building a fully baked strategy using the strategy cascade. And again, some of this, a chunk of that's based on Roger Martin's work. So let's move ahead. So what I want to do is to paint a picture of 2 possibilities, and these are examples of work that I've been involved with in my career, and choices that needed to be made. So possibility number 1 is a small group getting together and coming up with the idea of building an indoor GIS for warehouses. So let's walk through this whole framework that we started with. ideation first. The use case that we're talking about here is to locate packages. So we know that in warehouses, it's difficult to find packages to ship them out. So they're shipped in, they're shipped out. But when an order comes in, where is that package? Indoor GIS potentially can help solve that particular problem. And it's a time and money question, ultimately. So validation, is it a pain point? So conversation with customers resulted in it being, yeah, it was a pain point. Customers that owned warehouses were particularly concerned about the time wasted in searching around for packages and etc. So there was definitely a pain point there. Were there any solutions in the market which potentially solved this problem? No, there were not. So yes, it was a niche that had potential. What would a typical customer look like? Well, a lot of these guys were early adopters, and this is going back a few years, I should add that. So this may have changed over time, but these were early adopters. These were people that are looking to drive new technology. And again, if anyone's read Crossing the Chasm, you'll know what I'm talking about in terms of the characteristics of early adopters. But these were also people with limited budgets. They weren't going to spend millions of dollars on this particular solution. So there's our validation piece. And again, somebody or a group or that group would be answering these questions. From a technical discovery perspective, in this particular case, it required a mix of partners. So not only was it a hardware problem, it was also software as well. So multiple levels here, putting hardware into warehouses which can actually locate where things are. And there could be RFID tags on each of the containers. Again, depends on the technologies that was chosen. But there was a hardware component to this. There was a physical putting these things in place in the warehouses. There was also a software component to this, which was gathering that data in one place and managing that data. Technologies like Node-RED, Geo Event Server technologies which could solve that particular problem. And then ultimately what the deliverable would be from the customer, to the customer by the company that I was then working for, was a dashboard which allowed people to manage and locate things quickly, etc. So that was the discovery piece. The business model piece, this is a new area to the company that is doing this work. So Indoor didn't have, the Indoor component was brand new, warehouses, brand new, never worked in that space before, didn't have the expertise to actually build out what was proposed here. So that was one thing from the business model. The second thing is no past experience in that vertical. And then the other thing was, last piece there was sort of unclear on how to make money. So there was a mix of partners, there were some unknown pieces here. So some plenty of unknowns there, but some real positives there as well. Certainly cutting edge stuff. Let's look at possibility 2. Now this is a mobile GIS app for work management. So the ideation piece of this, the use case would be, and again, this was something that I worked on quite a number of years ago. It's really this notion of work order creation and management. So leveraging, in this case, the idea was bringing a location together with an asset management system. So it was bringing GIS and Maximo into the same interface. So one could see where things were, could ask questions of what was around those things, and also ultimately generate work orders. Not only generate them, but also see them and act against them. So that was the use case. In terms of validation, it was undoubtedly a pain point. There was a disconnect between field staff and office workers, the managers most often. So definite pain point. So again, lack of coordination, lack of management is a high value problem. Most things were done on paper. Very slow process, very expensive, information lost, information never get into the final place. Was it a niche at that time? Yes, it was. There was nobody actually doing that work, so it was somewhat unique. And then typical customers, in this case, it was large utilities. That was where the need initially came from, and that was where the exploration was done within these large utilities. It would potentially count to smaller utilities as well, but this use case was targeted at larger utilities. From a technical implementation perspective, it was really the integration of two enterprise systems. It was, in this case, it was ArcGIS and it was Maximo. So it was bringing these together in a single interface, allowing communication back and forth. There were no partners required for this. And then finally, the business model. Yes, there was staff in-house who had the expertise to build this out. And it was, for the organization I was working for, it was one of the core sectors that they were focused on. So it was an area where there were business relationships and technical expertise in-house. And then from a potential revenue perspective, it was known that the customers in that sector, if there were high value problems, potentially there was revenue there, there was budget there to actually pay for those. So that's the hypothesis for the second one, or the layout for the second one. So what we're going to do here is really shorten the odds. So we have two possibilities that we've discussed. What we're going to do now is move those possibilities through this strategic choice process. Now, I'll talk about this again in a minute, but the journey to a strategy is many and varied. This is one which greatly simplifies the process and takes some of the angst out of that journey away. So, the strategic choice process, let's summarize it. It isn't complex, as we're going to see. There are no clouds of data. Too often this journey is either throwing darts at a wall and building things. I mentioned in one of the earlier videos I did that too often I've seen MVPs built against an idea, or one customer suggesting it might be a good idea if they had this problem solved. So there's either the very limited work done in building out a strategy and understanding, you know, what are good options, good choices, good ideas. The other thing is death by data, is doing all sorts of strength and weaknesses type analyses. So clouds of data can be very problematic. This approach requires collaboration. I mentioned before how important collaboration is. This drives collaboration. So too often you can get too many dominant people in a room, whether it's been seniority, whether it be personality. Egos often get in the way there as well. This approach requires collaboration. It also encourages creativity. The initial journey within what could be potentially be a smaller group where you're building out these possibilities, that could be a small group that are encouraged to be creative, to come up with different ideas and to work through this process of validating it. Don't just come to the wider group, which we'll talk about in a second, with a notion. Give it some meat. Tell a good story. And ultimately, this drives agreement on the possibility with the greatest chance of success. So we are driving down to narrowing that choice of possibilities to one. And I mentioned more often that this process requires you to have at least 4 or 5 possibilities. One of those possibilities may well do nothing. You know, let's keep the status quo, do what we're doing well, and not look to build new services or products. That is also a reasonable hypothesis. So, winning conditions. This is really core to this whole process that we're working through. So what we're going to do here is we're going to walk each possibility through a list of what would have to be true to win conditions. And this is very much the wording from Roger Martin and his work. What would have to be true to win? So these are conditions. You can reword that as conditions for success. So what these things revolve around is the industry we're focused on, the customer value, the business model, and the competition. So we're going to build out a bunch of conditions, questions essentially, which we will ask the possibility, we'll judge the possibility against. So let's look at some use case conditions. Now I've created some conditions here which, looking through the 2 examples I've just given, the 2 use cases, the indoor GIS idea and the work management idea, we can walk through a bunch of questions and weigh up collectively the strengths and weaknesses of each of these arguments. And let me just step back to say that more often than not, the way this process works is that small group that have come up with that possibility, or possibilities plural, will present that story to a much wider group. And that wider group is made up of a cross-section of folks in the organization who we feel collectively can provide important input to making that final decision. So it could be senior folks. It could also be somewhat junior people as well. Anyone that may, we feel, be able to contribute to this conversation. So a presentation is made by individual groups telling their story. Each of those stories are weighed up against these conditions. So again, I'll walk through these conditions. Does what is being proposed fit into the company's sweet spot? In other words, do we know this sector, this subsector really well? Is it something we work in today, or is it brand new to us? Is this a high value pain point? So we've reached out to customers. We've not only have we discovered that there's a pain point here, but is it of high value? It's a very important question. Again, is it $1 million problem that needs a solution, or is it a $10 problem that needs a solution? Very different outcomes. Is it a winnable beachhead? And we'll talk about crossing the chasm in a future talk, but a winnable beachhead is there competition in that space currently, and can we win against that competition? If it's greenfield, that's there's no competition there. That's a good place to be. Why is it a greenfield? So is it a winnable beachhead? Niche, we can call that a niche. Do we have clear competitive advantages? And again, that's a much deeper dive conversation, that one. But is it clear when we look across, if there is competition in that particular beachhead or that place that we're targeting, do we have an advantage to win against that competition? And is it clear how we're going to make money? That business model conversation. Is it very clear on given if we have partners or we don't have partners, how are we going to actually build this out? And again, this is a deeper dive in the first level, but it's a group conversation. It's a group test on each of these stories. Which ones hold water? So I am not going to tell you which of those two stories are the ones which we would select. You can make that judgment for yourself. It's pretty obvious the way I've lined this up, actually, but you can go through this process yourself. You can look at some of those questions and any other questions that you may come to mind as you weigh those things up. And again, I'm just painting a picture here, and make your selection. So that's really what we're driving towards is I feel confident enough to make this possibility a reality. So those in the group can weigh things up. They can look at the output from the questions that were asked. They can have internal conversations, throw other information into the mix. But at the end of the day, collectively, the group have to feel confident that this is something they want to move forward with. So our goal is to narrow things down to a single possibility. Again, I use the word hypothesis. We'll bump into that again because all strategies are really hypotheses. So it's not only is it a single possibility, we've narrowed it down, that we all feel comfortable about that, but it's also something that we feel collectively has the greatest chance of winning. That's ultimately our goal here. So what we've built is really a skeleton strategy at the minute. We've made our choice. And we built some initial components, pieces, which will form ultimately that strategy that we build out. Now, this is somewhat of an adjustment against Roger Martin's work. I feel as though, like with smaller companies, this is a good place to go. If you're a bigger company who have lots of money and lots of time, it's a slightly different conversation. But to move through quickly, this process, I found is often the most effective way to do it. So let me summarize the steps we've been through. This is summarizing what we spoke about last conversation and this one. So your goal is to generate a set of possibility stories. Now, there's a framework which we've built, which is all about ideation, validation. That sets the structure of the stories that those smaller groups are going to tell. Those stories are then presented to the wider group. From there, the story, each story is run through the set of fixed conditions that we've got. What has to be true to win. And then what we're going to do, what the group does is have a conversation around the results of running through those possibilities through these conditions. Now, I use that word barrier conditions. Roger Martin talks a lot about barrier conditions. Barrier conditions are those ones that you're not sure about. Those are the ones that could be significant problems if you move forward. Pricing is an example. In the How to Win book, there's a pricing conversation in chapter 8, I believe it is, in the book, which talks about that as a significant barrier. If it's a beauty product, a skin product actually, oil of Olay, and price points was a massive concern to the group. So what they did was they ran tests, and that's the next point here. So can you test out these barrier conditions? If you've walked through possibilities and you've found that maybe two of the possibilities are good, both of them have conditions which you have doubts about, it's worthwhile running tests against those things. And again, this can be a very time-consuming, expensive business, but it needs to be done. Again, if one's going to minimize the risk of failure, you need to go into with the hypothesis that it's still a hypothesis, but you go into it with a comfortable feeling that you've tested out things and you've judged that the risk is lower. An MVP is, I was going to mention MVPs. MVPs can be a way to build products. I mean, an important part of building a product. An MVP can also be a way of testing out some of these barrier conditions as well. I mean, a question might be, do we actually understand that problem to solution journey? Do we need more time with the customer? Do we need to paint that picture more clearly? And MVPs can take on many different flavors. They can be simply a presentation. They can be an actual physical demo of software. You know, it shows the basic structure of how you might solve the problem. So there's a whole world of testing that could be done. But again, the goal is to arrive at a single possibility. So we've got that single possibility. We validated, we've gone through the whole process. We had a collective a conversation about it. We've maybe tested out the barriers. We're comfortable that's the one we're going to go with. The next step we're going to do, and again, I've mentioned that we already have a skeleton strategy, is we're actually going to build out the full strategy, and we're going to leverage the strategy cascade to do that. So we're going to build this out in depth, and that's what we're going to be talking about in my next talk. So anyway, I covered a lot there, spent much more time on this presentation than I would normally. So there's a lot of information. Again, I always welcome your feedback, your thoughts if you don't agree on what I'm talking about here. But I like the fact that this is a much more methodical step-through process rather than it being throwing darts at a wall or being over-analytical, which one can be as well. So I hope this helps. Again, welcome your feedback, and I'll look forward to doing the next talk in the very near future. Thanks for watching. Thanks for joining us on the Geospatial-Next channel. We're focused here on understanding the future of geospatial. That's both how we get to mainstream adoption of the technology and data, and how we start using blockchain and crypto to move things forward. Please feel free to subscribe to the channel, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.